and I'm trying to say it in a way that doesn't make me sound, again, like a completely annoying, pretentious grad student. It's neurochemistry and anthropology and heredity. And what I mean by that is our brains love dopamine and serotonin. Like they love the things that make us feel good. And I know that's self-evident, but essentially our logic is instantly hijacked the moment we find something that makes us feel good. You know, whether that's smoking crack, whether that's smoking cigarettes, whether that's drinking alcohol, whether that's getting in fistfights in parking lots, or whether it's eating food that involves killing animals. Like it's very hard to pry people away from a narrative that they've held on to that makes them feel good in the short term, even if it's diametrically opposed to their values and their ethics.
Hi, Moby. I'm Priscilla. So happy to have you on here. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
How did you become a vegetarian to begin with?
Vegan.
Well, but vegetarian first and then vegan, I think.
Yeah. In answering the question, I don't want to plagiarize myself because I did a TED talk about this.
Yes, we've seen it. And you also have your beautiful animated film as well.
Thanks. So basically, I grew up the same way I assume almost everyone grew up, which is I grew up in the suburbs. You know, I was born in the city, born in New York, grew up in the suburbs, and I had that schism of loving animals unconditionally, but also loving Burger King unconditionally.
Right.
And because that's this dominant cultural schism or paradoxical paradigm or paradigmatic paradox, however you want to think of it, it never even crossed my mind that this was strange to love animals and also contribute to their suffering and death. And then when I was around 19, I had my Saul on the road to Damascus moment. I was petting a rescue cat named Tucker that we had in our house. And I suddenly realized, like, oh, I would never in a billion years do anything to hurt Tucker the rescue cat, because Tucker has, you know, autonomy, independent, sentience, and a rich emotional life. And I, in that moment, realized that every animal had those same qualities, you know, a desire to just live a simple life and not suffer and die. And so that was 1984. And I became a vegetarian in 1984 and then a vegan in 1987. And of course, my main reason for being a vegan is the desire to not cause the suffering and death of animals, but also, as we found over time, like using animals for food is the third leading cause of climate change. It's the leading cause of antibiotic resistance, the leading cause of rainforest deforestation, and on and on and on. So it basically, my veganism and my animal rights activism is supported empirically and subjectively by almost everything.
And did it start with, I mean, do you remember your first rescue cat or dog or animal that you got?
Well, when I was very, very young, you know, I told you I was born in New York. And for the first 3 years of my life, my mom and my dad and I lived in a basement apartment in Harlem. And my parents were young and dysfunctional in every sense. So I think at a very early age, I sort of recognized that humans were unpredictable and terrifying, whereas the animal, we had a rescued dog, we had a rescued cat, we had 4 or 5 rescued lab rats. And so I grew up in this menagerie, and the animals were predictable. The animals were comforting. The animals, you know, didn't get drunk and go on tirades. So like almost from like day one, I kind of recognized that I preferred animals generally to people.
And like now, a lot of people live in Harlem, but back then, you know, it was a much rougher place. Yeah.
Harlem in 1965, 66, 67. I mean, granted, I was a tiny little baby, but it was pretty rough. I mean, my mom told me this story that like when she was 8 months pregnant with me, she was attacked on the street and a man tried to, sorry if this is very graphic, but it's pretty intense. Like a man tried to stab her and cut me out of her when she was 8 months pregnant with me. It was not perhaps the nicer, safer place it is today.
Yeah. Your mom, it sounds like, was committed to being kind to animals as well. Yeah. I mean, just because she's got all these rescue animals, so she must have been feeling that, or what were her thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's the weird schism, and it's such a dominant schism that it's almost hard to be surprised by it. Like my mom she loved animals. We had a house just filled with animals, even though we were very poor, we were on food stamps and welfare. We always had just this house filled with rescued cats, rescued dogs, rescued iguanas, rescued mice, rescued anything you could rescue, we brought into the house.
Right.
And the animals, we treated them so respectfully with so much love. But my mom and I also loved saving up money to go to McDonald's.
Right.
And it really, like, the moment you fully become cognizant of this schism, I guess it's that old Matrix cliche. It's like the moment you take whichever the pill that opens your eyes,
right,
you have to take a step back, and you're like, how in the world can people who love animals on a day-to-day basis cause the suffering and death of animals? Like it's really such cognitive dissonance. It's almost impossible to process.
Once you had that moment, your epiphany at 19, I think it was George that raised Tucker. Am I correct?
Well, my grandmother had this cranky old dachshund. Like George the dachshund had been reasonably friendly, let's say, for the first 4 years of his life. But as he became a senior citizen dachshund, he was just super cranky, just this irritable, cranky old dachshund. But then I found this tiny little barely alive baby kitten named Tucker, who was in a box by the dump with 3 or 4 dead kittens. I mean, Tucker was so young, his eyes weren't open. Right. And I found him, brought him home, and George, the super cranky dachshund, raised Tucker. Like all of a sudden, this 10 or 11-year-old angry dachshund became a mom. Oh. And then in the most disgusting ways, like cleaned up Tucker's poop and vomit with his tongue. Like, I mean, stuff that humans would never want to do. And all of a sudden, George the dachshund was happily cleaning up little baby Tucker the cat.
Yeah.
But my question is more at that moment, though, when you have this moment, did you start kind of looking around and then saying, okay, what do I do? I can't be eating animal, like it doesn't feel right. Did you do a lot of research? Did you find other cultures? There's a history of not eating meat that goes way, way back. Like, how do you begin this journey, for yourself in terms of a deeper way of understanding this?
Yeah. So when I was 19, and I remember it so clearly, sitting on the stairs in the little house that my mom and I lived in. The house had come with weird, thin orange carpeting on the stairs. So I'm sitting on the orange carpeting on the stairs in this suburban house, petting Tucker the cat, who at this point was about 8 or 9 years old. And then all of a sudden, it was like this synaptic tectonic shift. Like something happened, and all of a sudden I just had that realization, like I wouldn't hurt Tucker the cat, so by extension I should not hurt any animal. I respected Tucker the cat, so by extension I should respect all animals. And then I went out and tried to find out how to take this realization and live according to it, and at the time, like, this was pre-World Wide Web. It was I assume the internet existed between a few colleges, but this was 1984. So I had to, go to the library, where I found a couple of books like Diet for a New America by John Robbins, Peter Singer's book. Then I started hanging out in health food stores, which was weird because I was a weird punk rocker. So punk rockers tended to not, at the time, spend all that much time in hippie health food stores. And I slowly learned how to live according to my realization, according to my new beliefs.
So was your music, I guess, Fascination at that time, was that going on at the same time? Were you slowly becoming more and more a fan of music and were there bands that you saw yourself in?
Yeah, when I was 9, I started playing guitar. My mom had dated a country western musician, and he left and he stole a bunch of our things, but somehow he left his guitar behind. Right. It almost sounds like a country western song.
Yeah.
And so I started playing guitar. A friend of my mom's, who was this weird, interesting hippie, started giving me lessons. And this would have been around 1974, 75. And at the time, I liked the Beatles, I liked the Rolling Stones, but then my other big sort of tectonic shift was I saw this movie, and it's one of the weirdest movies ever made, called Mr. Mike's Mondo Video.
Oh, that's guy from the Monkees.
Oh
Mike
no, it's
Nesmith
actually that
made
was
that, yeah.
Mike Nesmith had
Yeah.
an amazing brief series called Elephant Parts, which is
Right.
really watching. Like, so this is
Right.
Mike O'Donoghue, and he was a writer for Saturday Night Live.
Right.
John Belushi.
Yep.
And he gathered together his favorite video clips and put them together in a movie called Mr. Mike's Mondo Video. And no one saw it, I think, except for my mom and I. And one of the clips he had was Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols singing My Way.
Right.
And I heard this and I was like, what in the world is this? And then I started hearing The Clash and Devo and, Elvis Costello. And so I lost complete interest in the world of classic rock. And at age 13 or 14, sort of started identifying as a punk rock new wave kid.
Right. I guess there's a spirit in that. Does that spirit then go over to your veganism in a way and to making the music that you ultimately made?
I hope so. It's funny. I was doing an interview yesterday with a Portuguese journalist, and my Portuguese is non-existent. Luckily, he spoke English very well. Right. But I was trying to, and I don't know if this made any sense to him or it'll make any sense to anybody, but it's, the Mies van der Rohe, Mies, the architect, correct?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
So Mies had this idea of form versus function.
Right.
And I remember, I don't know, for being 14 or 15 and reading about this idea of form versus function. And it seemed instantly, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense, that we live in a culture that either conflates the two or solely identifies with the form of things.
Right.
Punk rock being a perfect example. A lot of people think of punk rock, they're like, oh, angry white kids with funny hair screaming.
Right.
I was like, yeah, that sometimes is the form, but the underlying function was one of question everything, and in a very personalized, rational way, reject the things that are worthy of being rejected, embrace the things that are worthy of being embraced, and work to create your own world that has nothing to do with the status quo. And so that ethos of punk rock, we'll call it like the function of punk rock, is exactly the same as the function of veganism, of animal rights, of looking at a status quo that does not reflect or serve your values and saying to hell with it and rejecting it.
Were you also influenced by other literature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, it was such a wonderful, and this is the beauty of libraries in the 1970s into the early 80s, and academia as well. Like, the librarians in Connecticut, of all the libraries I used to go to, like, these were interesting counterculture women. And I say women because up until the time I was maybe 1986, 1987, I had never met a male librarian. But in the same thing with the teachers I had, they were all very counterculture. And so the moment I expressed an interest in the counterculture, suddenly my teachers got excited, the librarians got excited, and they started recommending things, And that's how I discovered, a lot of 20th century literature, and then art movements, Dadaism, Surrealism, Cubism, Fluxus. I remember a librarian introducing me to the writings of the Situationists.
Right.
Another librarian telling me about Rimbaud and The Drunken Boat and A Season in Hell. And my mom introducing me to Charles Bukowski. So these women saved me. I mean, like the librarians, the academics, my mom, like exposing me to books and art movements and cultural movements that were the exact opposite of suburban Connecticut in 1978.
It sounds like your mom really knew what things to look at, what things to engage you with.
Oh yeah, I mean, she lived in a very frustrating place for her. She had a lot of self-doubt about herself and her creativity because she was a very talented painter, but she never had the nerve to show her paintings to anyone.
Right.
And she almost completely embraced the counterculture,
right,
but was very attached to suburban comfort. So when I started playing in punk rock bands and reading about, Andre Breton and Marcel Duchamp and the Situationists later, obviously, she was thrilled by this. Like, so she did everything in her power to encourage me to listen to John Coltrane and read Fluxus manifestos. So I got really lucky there.
I mean, almost a perfect upbringing to prepare you for the work you ultimately engage in now, to be an artist.
Yeah, I am very grateful, and I'm incredibly fortunate that I grew up in a safe, boring suburban community surrounded by academics and my mom and my aunts and uncles who loved the suburbs, but they hated it. And the other thing I'm incredibly grateful for is that New York City was 40 minutes away. So as soon as my friends and I were, when we were old enough, at around 12 or 13, we started sneaking into the city. We talked about how dangerous New York was in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
By 1978 and 79, oh my God, New York was terrifying. And if our parents had known that we were spending so much time in the Lower East Side and in these really dangerous places, I mean, we were nervous, good kids. We weren't doing drugs. We weren't doing anything bad, but like we spent so much time in egregiously unsafe environments.
So is that like the Ramones and those bands, or Blondie, or is that like later?
Yeah, this is 78, 79. I mean, at that time, the venues were like, obviously CBGB's, A7, Great Gildersleeves. And then eventually, as time passed, like the Peppermint Lounge, Danceteria. And the bands were either like the hardcore bands of the time, like, the Misfits, Black Flag, Bad Brains, Minor Threat, but also some of the more underground New York bands who've gone on to have these weird, long, revered lives, like the Bush Tetras or Liquid or ESG. And we just got so lucky because we were 14 years old sneaking into these nightclubs, sometimes at 5 o'clock in the morning, like these after hours clubs like Fallout Shelter and AM, PM. We weren't drinking or doing drugs. We were just thrilled to be around this environment.
So what transpires between that and Go? Like what brings you all the way to the place that, you're not going to bands, you are the band?
I mean, I guess this might sound a little bit anodyne, but just a love of music and music culture and alternative culture and underground culture. So in the 80s, that manifested itself for me in the world of punk rock. As I mentioned, Bad Brains, Black Flag, Circle Jerks, Dead Kennedys, etc. But also the underground new wave community, bands like Theater of Hate, Killing Joke, then The Cure, The Smiths, and then very much so the sort of burgeoning urban electronic music scene.
Right.
So by 1985, 1986, I was slowly losing interest in guitars. The guitars were starting to feel kind of old to me.
Right.
At that time, hip hop had discovered the sampler. And so suddenly all, people like Eric B. and Rakim and Public Enemy were making these revolutionary hip hop tracks. Right. And then about at the same time, house music was invented. So suddenly this world of like Black, Latino, gay, urban electronic music was so, and it's hard in a way to imagine the context because we've now lived with these genres for such a long time. It's sometimes worth remembering that there was a sui generis cultural approach of these genres were invented. Like all of a sudden, like they hadn't existed, and almost overnight, suddenly these styles of music had just been invented. And it was a really fascinating, exciting time. So basically, by the late 80s, when I released the song Go, I just wanted to spend time in nightclubs. I just wanted to spend time around the world of music. Like I didn't even think of my music life as being necessarily separate from the community I was a part of, from the environment I was in. Like I listened to records, I made records. I DJ'd in nightclubs, but I also went to nightclubs. To me, it was just part and parcel of the same sort of milieu.
Ultimately you didn't give up the guitar because you play the guitar now, but at the time, was it a thing to give up the guitar, the thing you had been playing all that time, to make music without it? Was that a moment in time? Yeah,
it was, for me at least, this sort of constant year zero approach. And now my approach is, when it comes to genres of music or instruments, I sort of love everything. I love electronic music. I love punk rock. I like classical music. I love folk music. I love, I'm sort of indiscriminate in my love of different genres.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, for example, when I was 13 and discovered punk rock, I was like, oh, now I'm a punk rocker. That means this is year zero and I have to reject everything that came before punk rock.
Right.
Fast forward 10, let's say 6 or 7 years, and I discover electronic music. I'm like, oh, this is the new year zero. I have to reject everything that came before this. It does sort of reek of fundamentalism and absolutism. Right. And luckily, as time has passed, I've become less of an absolutist regarding genre, et cetera. But back then, it was you dove in and you embraced it completely and categorically and rejected everything else.
So in veganism, it's like climate change is obviously, me and Priscilla have worked on that a long time, but, at the end of the day, just killing animals is wrong. There's all those other reasons why it should, we shouldn't do it. But at the end of the day, we just, I agree with you totally about suffering. Animals just shouldn't suffer, period. Why do you think it's so hard to get this across to just the public, to people who are caring loving individuals, but don't necessarily understand the metaphor?
That is such a great question. And I wish I had an answer that's not going to make me sound like a pretentious grad student, because it really is it's a wonderful question. And everybody I know in the world of animal activism is asking themselves that question constantly. Especially because I do activism at slaughterhouses, I bear witness at vigils, and the people who are working in the slaughterhouses, a lot of them are good people, but this is the only job they can get. That question, how can good people be involved in an industry, and this is including consumers, that kills 1 trillion animals a year? And one would also think, and I think every animal rights activist has this experience, where once you realize the truth of it, you assume that once you expose other people to the truth of it, they will reject the past and embrace this better way of living, or this different way of living, this more ethical way of living. And clearly that's not the case. When you go to a meat eater and say, hey, you're torturing and killing animals, or you're supporting the torture and murder of animals, meat eaters tend to not respond very well to that. I certainly didn't when I was a meat eater. And the only answer I have is, and I'm trying to say it in a way that doesn't make me sound, again, like a completely annoying, pretentious grad student. It's neurochemistry and anthropology and heredity. And what I mean by that is our brains love dopamine and serotonin. They love the things that make us feel good. And I know that's self-evident, but essentially our logic is instantly hijacked the moment we find something that makes us feel good. Whether that's smoking crack, whether that's smoking cigarettes, whether that's drinking alcohol, whether that's getting in fistfights in parking lots, or whether it's eating food that involves killing animals. It's very hard to pry people away from a narrative that they've held on to that makes them feel good in the short term, even if it's diametrically opposed to their values and their ethics. And the other thing that supports that is community. As we've seen now, it's and I'm going to unfortunately be a little partisan, but we see that on the far right, and maybe it's true for the far left as well, but on the far right especially, their sole criteria for assessing information is, does it make me feel good? Does it bind me to my community?
Right.
So they become anti-vaxxers, they become anti-maskers, they don't believe in climate change, they don't believe that guns kill people. Many of them believe that the earth is flat, et cetera. It's because their criteria for information is not whether it's true, not whether it's consistent with their beliefs, but does it make them feel good and does it bind them to a community? And so I think that's why it's so hard to get people to recognize that eating animals is contrary to most people's values.
I've seen some of those videos at the slaughterhouse. I don't think I could actually go. I don't know that I could handle that. And it's good that they make all these fake meats now. Some of them are quite good, but some of them they design them so that they taste like meat, which is better than not having it. But for me, it's like, I don't want anything that tastes like meat. I mean, what's your feeling about that?
Well, it's funny. I read an article in the New Yorker. I think Tad Friend wrote it. It was about this rise of fake meat. And they were interviewing the CEO of Impossible Meat, the guy who sort of made or invented the Impossible Burger. And they asked him this question, and his response was so great. He said, "Oh, Impossible Burger's not for vegans." He's like, "It's for some guy in Oklahoma who otherwise would go to Arby's." And so I have to remind myself, like, okay, lab grown meat, fake meat, like, I'm not the target demographic for it. It's kind of like if I was to criticize a Disney movie made for 12-year-olds, like, well, I'm not in the target demographic. My criticism is probably not that valid. So my feeling around fake meat is I probably eat it once every 2 years. Like if I was to go to a July 4 barbecue and there were tofu pups on the grill, I might have a tofu pup. But I tend to not eat fake meat because I never really liked meat that much to begin with. But I love that it exists. I love that it's an option for either like new vegetarians, new vegans, or even just people who want to do better. You know, that old Voltaire quote that Obama paraphrased in his first inaugural address of "Don't let the pursuit of the perfect be the enemy of the good."
Right.
So the fact that fake meat can reach people wherever they are in their sort of like progression, I love it for that.
Do you think now, though, I mean, since when you started this journey and there was no internet, you maybe felt isolated, there is a worldwide, there's a group of people that are committed to veganism, to a lot of these issues. Do you feel there is a community now, and that the efforts that it would take to reduce climate change, all these things that have been so committed to, where are we now in what's possible, do you think? Or are we always going to have that dichotomy of, the struggle between what you just articulated, the extreme left, the extreme right? People are going to hold on to what they believe in, what makes them feel good. How do you feel now, these many years later, about what's possible?
Well, and I'm going to name drop for a second. When Cory Booker was elected to the Senate, we got on the phone because he's an old friend of mine. I knew him when he was first running for mayor of Newark. And to his credit, his first question that he asked when we got on the phone after he was elected to the Senate was, "What can we do to help animals?" First question. And I was like, as far as the undying love I have for him, it was solidified in that moment. But we were talking, and he paraphrased the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, like the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice, which it does historically, but it also bends towards evidence-supported reason. And people might hate that, especially if they're attached to an irrational, unethical status quo, like slavery, or women not being allowed to vote, or same-sex couples not being allowed to get married, or smoking on airplanes, or what have you. Like there's so many instances in history of a status quo being pernicious and ultimately rejected. I have to hope that will be the case regarding a lot of what we're doing, not just using animals for food, but, burning oil and coal and gas, like there's, using antibiotics 99% of the time when they're not called for, filling the oceans with microplastics, burning down the rainforest. Like these are obviously all terrible things. It's the question, will we wake up and address these issues and fix them in time to save us?
I think all of these issues are sort of the same issue, not living in balance with the natural world. Do you think there are signs of progress? As dark as it is, we sit here after what just happened, with these children a couple of days ago. And, it's like I was listening on the radio this morning, they were talking about there might be something that they're going to try and do in the Congress around gun control. But it's like, even in the darkness, are there signs of light? For animals and for our society to live more in balance?
I really hope so. Yeah, that's, I mean, honestly, you can look at the world and find a million reasons to despair. And unfortunately, and this is something I realized decades ago, I guess it was like the mid 80s, and I was on a subway in New York on a Sunday night, and there was a copy of the New York Post on the floor in front of me. And it was the year in New York history that New York had the highest murder rate. And so the screaming headline of the New York Post was like something like New York City murder capital. And it was so graphic and dramatic. And I was like, wow. And I had this emotional reaction to it. But then I looked around the subway car and it was filled with quiet people on their way home from work, or, people reading a book. And I was like, oh, anger gets people's attention. Like, there's no headline. Imagine the New York Post running a headline like quiet people on the subway going home after work, and
Right.
Unfortunately, I guess it's that question of like, what is the truth of the world in which we live? And what is the truth of the algorithms that present us with information? Because obviously the algorithms love anger. The algorithms, they're like the guy, I'm embarrassed, I don't know his name, the emperor in Star Wars who's encouraging Luke Skywalker to be angry. Like, those are the algorithms. They love our anger, they love our divisiveness. They want people to engage in the most vitriolic ways. Sometimes it's called for. Our horror around what just happened in Texas, like, that is justified, the anger, the outrage, because it's preventable. So I don't know. The one thing that gives me a lot of hope is humanity's ability to fix problems in ways that we never would have expected. An example would be, like, I don't know if you remember, in the 1990s, there was this big debate about the plastic waste around compact discs. Obviously, compact discs are about as unecologically friendly possible as you could make anything, like plastic, weird metal that no one understands. Everything about it's an environmental disaster. And at first, the record companies made long boxes, which took unecologically friendly compact discs and put them in an even less ecologically friendly package. And there was all this argument about how will they ever come up with an ecologically friendly way of, distributing music. No one thought that answer was going to be the internet. Music was suddenly going to be non-physical. Or you think of like the problem of horse waste. Like, up until the late 19th century, cities were just filled with horse poop, and there was horse waste everywhere. And people are like, what's the solution going to be? And it's like, oh, the automobile. Obviously, the automobile created worse problems, but my possibly pedantic point being, humans do sometimes figure out these fascinating ways of fixing problems. And they're fascinating in that they tend to not be linear. It's not like A plus B equals C. It's A plus B equals something unimaginable.
Do you have touchstones you go back to? Do you go back to a Duchamp painting or a Rousseau quote or a prophetic message? Is there something that when you want to reorient your thinking or you're beginning a project that you go back to?
What a wonderful question. And thanks for asking it, because it's just fun to remember what all those things are. One of them is the Tao Te Ching. When I was 15 years old, I had the biggest crush of my life on a woman named Louise Stoner. That was her actual name. And even though she was a white lady from Connecticut, she loved Taoism. So to impress her, I went out and bought a copy of the Tao Te Ching. She had no interest in me or the fact that I was pretending to be interested in Taoism. But I kept that copy of the Tao Te Ching with me, and it sits on my bedside table, and I read it honestly almost every day. Even just the first, chapter 1 or poem 1 of the Tao Te Ching is one of the most centering things I could possibly read. It's also fascinating if you're bored. It's very short, but go back and reread the first poem of the Tao Te Ching, because even though it was made 5,000 years ago, it talks about particle wave theory and like how Lao Tzu or whoever wrote it somehow was channeling quantum mechanics 5,000 years ago. It's kind of miraculous. So that, and honestly, one thing that I've been going back to a lot lately is sort of the 20th century ethos of experimentation. I don't want to, and I apologize if I sound like an old cranky guy, but I feel like culturally, we've sort of lost a lot of experimentation. I love sitting down and watching fun shows on Netflix, et cetera, but like rarely, apart from maybe the show Severance, rarely do I feel like there's this ethos of unbridled experimentation. It tends to be very conservative. And I really do sort of miss the Duchamps, the David Lynches, the Coltranes, the Arshil Gorky's, the de Koonigs, the people who were sort of aggressively experimenting. And so it's nice being reminded that like art and culture and music and literature used to be challenging and experimenting in really fascinating, wonderful ways.
It strikes me that if you were looking at the Tao Ching, I think you were already on your path because you were 15 and you were 19. So all of these events were leading you perhaps to that moment. You were being led, if one chooses to believe, to look at one's life like that.
I hope so. And I wonder what'll happen, like if those trajectories, like if your trajectories, my trajectory, if we ever are shown them in hindsight. I mean, there's the classic terrible inspirational portrait that's probably hanging in, I don't know, some office somewhere in the Midwest of like, like there were 2 footsteps in the sand and then there were only one and then I was carrying you, etc. But those trajectories in hindsight, it's this fascinating aspect of our lives is we will never understand the things that we've been protected from. The choices we were, even if it's like seemingly ostensibly benign choices, like the person we didn't meet who would have taken us on a more mundane journey. It's really so interesting to like the accidents we didn't have, or the more expanded utility of the mistakes we've made or the accidents we've actually had. Like it's really fascinating. And we obviously can have no objectivity or insight around that for the most part while we're alive.
Well, Moby, thank you so much.
Yeah.
What a wonderful conversation. And for all of you who already know who Moby is, or maybe you don't, please go explore his music, his storytelling, his art. He has a great piece, Why I'm a Vegan. He has a TED Talk. His music extends. And you are doing that. You are living that life. You are bringing all that forward. So
and 2 books, 2 written
and your books as well,
and photography books, a lot of art.
Hearing you describe that, I could either be self-serving and say like, wow, I've done a lot, or I could just be like, realize I'm such a loudmouth. Like what's
right. But don't stop, whatever you're doing. Please keep going.
Well, for better or worse, I don't think I would know. Like when I hear about people who go on vacations, etc., I'm like, I just wouldn't know how to do that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Sounds like somebody I know.
Yeah. Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for taking the time. This was really fun.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.